How long after a car accident does it take before you feel pain? Well, it depends. For a lot of injuries, it happens immediately. I mean, you know. But there are other types of injuries where it may be a day or two or even more before the pain shows up. My name is Jeb Butler, and I'm an attorney at the Butler Kahn Law Firm. And today, we'll talk about 3 types of injuries where the pain from the car accident may not show up for a day or 2 or even more. And the first type that we'll talk about is a head injury. The brain is a funny organ, and brain injuries affect everyone differently. So when there's been a traumatic brain injury that can involve personality changes, it sometimes takes a few days for the plaintiff, the person who's been hurt, and the family around him to figure out that this is something different. It's not just a bad mood that's going to go away. I can also remember a case that our firm handled involving a woman in an Uber. She'd been in an Uber and then in a side flight collision. And it didn't seem that serious, but her head had hit the headrail, that part of the car where the passenger sometimes has a little grab handle. And she wasn't hurting that bad, so she went home, didn't think much of it. But over the next several days, the pain slowly got worse and worse until it was serious and she knew something was wrong. So she goes into the emergency room. It turns out she had a bleed in her brain, and it had just taken, or in her skull, and it had just taken days for the blood to accumulate enough to start causing enough pain to let her know that something was seriously wrong. She had to have surgery to relieve the pressure. I mean, it was a serious injury, but it didn't show up. It wasn't obvious to her, to our client, until several days after the collision had happened. The next kind of collision, or next kind of injury that we'll talk about is a spinal injury. Now, sometimes spinal injuries hurt really badly immediately, but not always. I can recall one case we worked on where our client sustained a really serious spinal injury. It wasn't just a disc. We've handled a lot of cases where there are ruptured or herniated or bulging discs, and those can work the same way. But this guy actually had a fracture in one of his vertebrae that you could see on an x-ray. But after the collision, he went home. He was one of these, tough guys who never wants to go to a doctor and never seek medical treatment. And he was, the breadwinner for his family. So he felt like, I got to get to work. And he did. He went. But the pain just got worse and worse and worse until he figured out it was a serious problem. And that can happen particularly with spinal injuries, whether they're fractures or disc injuries, because the pain from spinal injuries isn't the same every day. The level of pain goes up and down and up and down. So sometimes people are getting better. They feel like they're on the upswing all of a sudden, and then suddenly it gets worse again. And then it starts to get better, and they're hopeful, and it's worse again. So it can take a while, days or more, before the significance or the severity of the injury, of the spinal injury, is obvious. And then the third kind of injury we'll talk about are injuries involving lots of inflammation. If you've been in a car wreck and gotten checked out in an emergency room, you may have heard about this. Sometimes these get called whiplash injuries, although it can happen in other ways as well. But what happens here is that you have injuries to soft tissues, typically in the neck, sometimes in the back, muscles, and that kind of thing. And when they're hurt, they can start to spasm or like flex, and that can cause pain. They also swell a little bit over time. And so at first, you've got adrenaline pumping, and that swelling really hasn't happened, so the pain hasn't set in. But as you may have heard at an emergency room, if you've ever been in an ER for something like this, the pain on day 2 or day 3 after the collision is often worse, because by then the inflammation has really set in and really started to cause pain. So it sometimes takes a day or 2 or more before the seriousness of the injuries is apparent and something that people recognize as important enough to go to a doctor.